June 6, 1944. Dawn had broken over northern France, but at the headquarters of the German 15th Army, stationed along the Pas de Calais, the mood was one of tense, watchful anticipation rather than alarm. Reports were filtering in of paratroopers landing in Normandy, of naval bombardments along a stretch of coastline nearly 200 miles from where most German commanders believed the real blow would fall. And yet, even as the largest amphibious invasion in human history unfolded on the beaches of Normandy, the bulk of Germany's most powerful field army remained rooted in place, waiting for an attack that would never come. This was not incompetence. It was not chance. It was the culmination of one of the most elaborate deceptions ever conceived in the history of warfare. A campaign so meticulously constructed that it convinced Adolf Hitler himself, along with his most senior generals, that Normandy was merely a diversion, and that the true Allied assault would strike at Calais weeks later, led by a general the Germans feared above all others. For nearly 7 weeks after the actual invasion began, German forces at Pas de Calais held their position, paralyzed by uncertainty, while Allied troops fought to secure their foothold in France. How could this happen? How could an intelligence apparatus as sophisticated as Germany's be so thoroughly misled at the most critical moment of the war in the West? To understand that, we need to go back further, to the desperate strategic calculations of 1943, when the Allies first confronted the terrifying arithmetic of invading Hitler's fortress Europe. By the autumn of 1943, the Allies had settled on a plan to invade northern France the following year, an operation that would eventually be codenamed Overlord. But planners in London and Washington understood a brutal truth. A frontal assault against prepared German defenses without some form of strategic surprise risked catastrophic failure. The Wehrmacht had spent years fortifying the coastline of Western Europe, and German intelligence would almost certainly detect preparations for an invasion of this scale. Ships, landing craft, troops, and equipment could not simply vanish from view. The challenge, then, was not whether the Germans would know an invasion was coming, but whether they could be misled about when, and more importantly, where. This recognition gave rise to Operation Bodyguard, a sprawling deception strategy overseen by the London Controlling Section, a secretive planning body tasked with coordinating strategic deception across the European theater. Bodyguard was not a single operation, but an umbrella framework, encompassing multiple interlocking deceptions, designed to scatter German attention and resources across a wide arc of potential targets, from Norway to the Balkans to the south of France. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating intelligence operations, consider subscribing because we'll be uncovering the layers of this deception in the detail it deserves. Within Bodyguard, 2 operations mattered most for the coming invasion of France: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North aimed to convince German high command that the Allies intended to invade Norway, tying down German divisions that might otherwise reinforce France. It relied heavily on fabricated radio traffic, suggesting a fictitious British Fourth Army was massing in Scotland, along with diplomatic pressure on neutral Sweden designed to filter back to German intelligence. Fortitude South, however, would prove to be the campaign's masterpiece, a deception aimed squarely at protecting the Normandy landings by convincing the Germans that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, and the most direct route into Germany itself. The logic behind targeting Calais was sound, and that was precisely what made the deception so effective. German planners, applying reasonable military logic, expected the Allies to choose the shortest sea crossing, allowing for maximum air cover and fastest reinforcement. Fortitude South did not need to invent an implausible scenario. It merely needed to reinforce a conclusion the Germans were already inclined to reach, and then keep reinforcing it, even after the real invasion began. To sell this fiction, the Allies needed something far more elaborate than false radio chatter. They needed an entire phantom army. And so, in the fields of Kent and East Anglia, positioned directly opposite the Pas de Calais, planners constructed the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a fictional military formation that, according to German intelligence, comprised experienced combat divisions poised to strike across the narrowest point of the Channel. In reality, FUSAG existed largely on paper, sustained by a combination of physical deception, electronic trickery, and human intelligence manipulation so convincing that it would occupy German strategic thinking for months. The choice of commander for this phantom army was perhaps the single most inspired decision of the entire operation. General George S. Patton, one of the most aggressive and capable armored commanders in the Allied arsenal, was assigned command of Fusag. German intelligence held Patton in extraordinarily high regard. Viewing him as America's most dangerous field commander, the general the Allies would surely choose to lead their main invasion thrust. By placing Patton, very publicly, at the head of this fictitious army, Allied planners exploited German assumptions about their own adversary. Patton's presence lent credibility to an army that did not exist, because German intelligence simply could not accept that such a prominent commander would be given a subordinate or diversionary role. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the psychological sophistication at work. This wasn't just about hiding troop movements. It was about understanding exactly how the enemy thought, and using that understanding against them. Patton's public movements were carefully choreographed to reinforce this fiction. He toured units, delivered speeches, and was photographed inspecting troops in locations consistent with Fusag's supposed staging areas, all while real Allied planning proceeded elsewhere, under different commanders, including General Omar Bradley, who would actually lead American ground forces into Normandy. But convincing the Germans that Fusag existed required far more than one famous general standing in a field. It required an entire physical and electronic ecosystem of deception, built with extraordinary attention to detail by engineers, camouflage specialists, and signals experts working under strict secrecy. Across the countryside of southeastern England, dummy camps sprang up, complete with tents, vehicle parks, and fuel depots, designed to appear, from the air, indistinguishable from genuine military installations. Rubber and inflatable tanks, light enough for a handful of soldiers to move into position, were arranged in formations that mimicked real armored divisions when photographed by German reconnaissance aircraft. Wooden and canvas mock-ups of aircraft-lined runways that saw little genuine air traffic, while dummy landing craft, constructed from canvas stretched over metal or wooden frames, floated in harbors along the southeastern coast, giving the impression of invasion fleets being assembled for a channel crossing. This physical deception was reinforced by something the Germans could not photograph, but relied upon just as heavily: radio traffic. Specialist signals units generated a constant stream of false wireless communications, simulating the administrative chatter of entire army formations, unit movements, supply requests, training exercises, all engineered to be intercepted by German listening posts. Genuine radio traffic patterns from actual divisions preparing for Normandy were deliberately suppressed or relocated, while the airwaves around Kent and East Anglia buzzed with the electronic signature of an army that existed only in the ether. Constructing this illusion demanded staggering logistical coordination. Thousands of personnel, from engineers and set designers to radio operators and camouflage officers, participated in building and maintaining this deception, and every one of them had to understand, at least in part, why absolute secrecy was essential. A single leak, a careless conversation, or a captured document referencing the true nature of these installations could have unraveled months of careful work. The margin for error was almost non-existent. If you appreciate just how much coordinated effort went into pulling off a deception this large, let us know in the comments which part of this operation surprises you most, because there's still more remarkable detail ahead. Physical deception and false signals, however, could only accomplish so much on their own. The most devastating weapon in the Fortitude arsenal was human. A network of German agents operating in Britain who had, unknown to their handlers in Berlin, been captured, turned, or were entirely fictitious constructs of British intelligence. This was the double-cross system, run by the 20 Committee under MI5, and it represented perhaps the most successful counterintelligence operation of the entire war. By 1944, virtually every German agent operating in Britain was, in fact, under Allied control. This allowed British intelligence to feed a carefully calibrated diet of information back to German intelligence services, information that was often genuine and verifiable in minor details, lending credibility to fabrications woven throughout. Among these double agents, none proved more valuable than a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the Allies by the codename Garbo. Pujol's story is remarkable even by the standards of wartime intelligence. Motivated by opposition to fascism, he had initially approached British intelligence offering his services as a spy, only to be turned away. Undeterred, he began fabricating reports as a purported German agent in Britain, despite never having set foot in the country. drawing on library books, guidebooks, and imagination to construct convincing fictional intelligence for German handlers, who believed they were receiving reports from a well-placed asset. British intelligence eventually recognized his talent for deception, and Garbo was formally recruited, given a network of entirely invented sub-agents, and positioned at the very heart of the Fortitude deception. By D-Day, Garbo had constructed a fictional network of more than 20 sub-agents, supposedly scattered across Britain, each providing different pieces of a carefully orchestrated puzzle to German intelligence. German handlers trusted this network so completely that Garbo would later be awarded the Iron Cross by Germany, even as he simultaneously received an MBE from the British government, a stark illustration of just how thoroughly he had penetrated and manipulated German confidence. Garbo's most consequential message came after the Normandy landings had already begun. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed ashore, Garbo transmitted a message to his German handlers describing troop movements consistent with a genuine invasion already underway, but framing it as merely a preliminary diversion intended to draw German reserves away from the true target, the Pas de Calais. This message reached Hitler's headquarters and reinforced existing assumptions at precisely the moment when German commanders were assessing whether to commit their strategic reserves toward Normandy. It is difficult to overstate the significance of this single transmission, arriving at the exact moment German High Command was weighing its most consequential decision of the invasion period. The success of Garbo and the double-cross system depended entirely on German intelligence's own institutional weaknesses. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been compromised to an extent its leadership never fully grasped, while rivalries between the Abwehr and the SS intelligence apparatus, the Sicherheitsdienst, hampered coordinated analysis. German intelligence assessments of Allied order of battle in Britain were consistently and significantly inflated, partly because of the deception itself, and partly because of pre-existing analytical failures that overestimated Allied troop strength by a considerable margin. This created fertile ground for Fortitude's fictions to take root, because German planners were already inclined to believe the Allies possessed a far larger invasion force than genuinely existed, large enough, in fact, to mount 2 separate major invasions. At the center of this web of deception sat Adolf Hitler, whose own strategic instincts aligned conveniently with the fiction the Allies were constructing. Hitler had at various points expressed genuine concern about the Pas de Calais as a likely invasion site, given its proximity to Germany and strategic importance. This was not a belief manufactured entirely by Fortitude. Rather, Fortitude skillfully reinforced a conviction Hitler already held, making it exceptionally difficult for German commanders on the ground, some of whom held different views, to convince him otherwise. Historians have noted that Hitler's intuitive military judgments, though frequently disastrous elsewhere in the war, in this instance dovetailed precisely with what Allied deception planners needed him to believe, making him simultaneously the most powerful decision-maker in the German war machine and one of the most receptive audiences for Allied deception. It's worth pausing to acknowledge that historians continue to debate the exact weighting of causes behind Germany's strategic misjudgment. Some scholars emphasize the primacy of the double-cross system and Garbo's network as decisive factors, while others place greater weight on Hitler's own pre-existing strategic assumptions or on the broader intelligence failures within German military institutions. What is not in dispute is the outcome. German forces remained divided, uncertain, and ultimately unable to respond decisively when the real invasion came. If you're finding this level of historical nuance valuable, a like on this video genuinely helps others discover carefully researched history content like this. As spring 1944 progressed, preparations for the actual invasion intensified across southern England, running in careful parallel with the fictional buildup in the southeast. Ports along the Channel coast grew crowded with landing craft. Troops underwent final training exercises, and meteorologists worked around the clock analyzing the notoriously unpredictable weather patterns of the English Channel, aware that conditions on the chosen invasion date could determine the fate of the entire operation. General Dwight Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, bore the immense weight of the final decision regarding when to launch Overlord, ultimately choosing to proceed on June 6th, despite marginal weather conditions, based on a narrow window of improved conditions identified by his meteorological team. When the invasion finally began, the deception campaign did not simply conclude, it entered its most critical phase. Allied planners understood that the initial landings, however successful, would remain vulnerable until sufficient reinforcements and supplies could be brought ashore. If German commanders realized quickly that Normandy represented the primary invasion and redirected the 15th Army and its armored reserves accordingly, the consequences for Allied forces still establishing their beachhead could have been severe. This is precisely why the continuation of the fortitude deception after D-Day proved just as consequential as everything that preceded it. For weeks following the initial landings, German high command remained divided over whether Normandy represented the main Allied effort or merely a preliminary diversion preceding a larger assault at Calais. Garbo's continued transmissions, along with sustained radio deception and the ongoing visible presence of Fusag's phantom forces in southeastern England, reinforced this uncertainty. The German 15th Army, one of the most powerful and battle-ready formations in the German order of battle, remained largely stationed at the Pas de Calais for critical weeks after D-Day, its divisions withheld from the Normandy front out of continued fear that the true invasion was yet to come. This delay proved immensely consequential. Allied forces, though facing fierce resistance and difficult terrain, particularly in the hedgerow country of Normandy, were able to consolidate their beachhead, land reinforcements, and build up supplies without confronting the full weight of German reserves that might otherwise have been concentrated against them in those critical early days. Historians studying the Normandy campaign have consistently identified this delayed commitment of German reserves as one of the decisive factors enabling the Allies to maintain and expand their foothold in France. None of this is to suggest the deception operated without risk or friction. Allied commanders lived with constant anxiety that the fiction might unravel, that a captured document, a defector, or simple German skepticism might expose the entire architecture of lies underpinning fortitude. The consequences of exposure would have been severe, potentially freeing German forces to concentrate against Normandy at precisely the moment Allied forces were most vulnerable. This tension, the knowledge that months of extraordinarily complex planning could collapse from a single mistake, defined the entire deception effort from its earliest planning stages through the tense weeks following the actual invasion. Looking back across the full arc of Operation Bodyguard and its component deceptions, historians continue to regard this campaign as among the most successful and consequential deception operations in military history, not because of any single stroke of genius, but because of the remarkable convergence of so many interlocking elements. Physical deception convincing enough to withstand aerial reconnaissance, electronic deception sophisticated enough to fool German signals intelligence, human intelligence manipulation thorough enough to compromise Germany's entire spy network in Britain, and psychological insight precise enough to exploit both German strategic assumptions and Hitler's own instincts. Few deception operations in history have combined so many disciplines so effectively, and fewer still have carried stakes as consequential as the survival of the Normandy beachhead and the ultimate liberation of Western Europe. What Operation Fortitude and the broader bodyguard deception ultimately demonstrate is that victory in the Second World War was not determined solely by industrial output, troop numbers, or battlefield tactics, though all of these mattered enormously. It was also shaped by intelligence, patience, and the disciplined execution of an elaborate fiction, sustained by thousands of individuals who understood that their work, however unglamorous or hidden from public view, could determine whether an entire invasion succeeded or collapsed on the beaches. The soldiers who stormed Normandy's beaches on June 6, 1944 did so because a small group of planners, analysts, double agents, and deception specialists had spent months constructing a story convincing enough to keep German reserves waiting nearly 200 miles away for weeks that would prove decisive. It remains, to this day, one of the most remarkable demonstrations of how carefully constructed deception, built on patience and precision rather than force, helped shape the outcome of the 20th century's most consequential military campaign.